All right, welcome everyone. Today we're actually going to cover a lot. We're going to look at First Corinthians chapters 5 and 6, but more specifically, we're going to really discuss the topic of human sexuality, or at least sexuality in the ancient world. I do know that this is a personal and also sensitive topic, and also it could be a taboo topic depending on what Christian community you are part of or associated with. Maybe you've never talked about this, but Paul certainly does. And so we will be looking at Paul's discussion on human sexuality within the Corinthian letters, with a particular focus on sexuality in the Greco-Roman age, which is vastly different from ours today. So let's begin. So we can know already that the Corinthians church was struggling with their human sexuality. And what we see here is that Paul he's directly addressing them. And there's several topics that he's addressing in chapters 5 through 7. But they all kind of like are interrelated with one another. And also Paul also recognizes that it's impacting not just them individually, but it's also impacting the wider church as well. There was this, ethical failure to appropriately respond to the issues in the community. So here's a couple of challenges that we see here in Corinth. One of the first one is that the Corinthian church had a member, kind of like a stepson, who was having a relation with his father's wife. This is in First Corinthians 1, chapter 5, verse 1, and also in verse 11. And we also can notice that this Corinthian community, they did boast. They boasted of this relationship, possibly celebrating it instead of mourning and expelling the individual from the community. And when we look at this and we think like, oh, that's really weird, how does a stepson have a relation with his father's wife? Um, One of the things to keep in mind is also age differences in marriage. So young girls were married or given in marriage very young. And so lot of men were generally 20 to 30 years older than their wives. But I'll explain that a little bit later. Um, they have this misunderstanding on the role and relationship of their human sexuality and the worship of God. They didn't recognize that they also worship God with their sexuality. How one lives and operates within the human body, what one loves is also a reflection of what one worships. And so Paul does list various sexual sins that are inappropriate for the church. And he uses certain terms that are difficult to translate. I want to be honest with you. But he uses that word immorality. Also uses the word effeminacy, which doesn't necessarily mean what we think it means. It's just really difficult a word to translate. And also Paul does create a term homosexuality, but he also uses another term prostitution, which is sometimes translated as immorality. So this word, even immorality, sometimes it's a translation of the same term that also comes out as adultery or prostitution. And so Paul uses a lot of different terms. One of the reasons why he also uses a different terminology because he's trying to use a variety of words to help explain all of these different practices. And so he's using a very robust vocabulary here. And likewise, Paul talks about marriage a lot, especially singleness. A lot of the Corinthians did have questions about marriage. And I want to be also honest. When we think about marriage today, we're thinking about like, a groom and a bride. They have marriage, they live happily ever after. We're thinking about marriage in terms of like, Disney, Walt Disney and all the Disney movies. And so everyone's happy, living happy ever after. But in the ancient world, people got married solely for the purpose of having kids. And sometimes they would have kids and women will have kids until they died. And we know this because of the many, many tombstones and inscriptions. And you will see the list of the women and how many kids she had, and even then how many of those kids that she had, how many of them died. And so it was almost portrayed as a great honor for a woman to have kids and die. Uh, and you even see with the Roman emperor, he started to give special tax status for women who would have so many kids. So if they would have so many kids, they were praised and given a special status. They wouldn't have to pay taxes and all these things. And so there is this encouragement to have kids. One of the first Roman divorces that is recorded is the result of not having kids. So that's one of the reasons why men would get a divorce because the wife could not have kids. And also too, despite the fact that the husband loved her. So you do see some of these recorded instances and discussions about divorce and when it's appropriate to divorce. For the ancients, if a woman cannot have kids, that was a justification to divorce the woman. And it's okay. So it had nothing to do with love or anything like that. It had to do kind of woman etiquette. And so there's a lot of this on that when we're thinking about marriage and singleness. And so all of a sudden you have a gospel and you don't have to get married. What? Women are gonna really like that because you're Paul's talking about celibacy as another option for women and also men as well, but it's another option, which in the ancient world would have been frowned upon. It would have like, what do you mean you're going to be celibate? That was not something that was championed or valued. It wasn't until the early Christian movement that you start to see celibacy really take ground and become something that is championed. And so also too, Paul responds to the community's questions by offering advice on marriage and authority of men and women have towards each other's bodies, also grounds for divorce, and also those who desire to remain celibate. And so here we have Lot. We have Lot. And also one minor point as well, and this comes out when we're thinking about Jesus, because Jesus did not get married. He didn't have kids of his own. Now, for the oldest male to not be married would have brought shame on the family. Because if the older male is not married, what does that do for the inheritance of the father? The land, everything that the family owns, it throws it into jeopardy. So it's one of those things that's like, what do you mean you're not going to get married? You're out of the brothers, assuming that there was brothers in the family. Um, who's going to take over? Is our inheritance going to be passed to our daughter? And then our daughter gets married, or the daughter gets married, or the sister gets married, and now it goes to the other family. So, being married in the ancient world was about having kids, about continuing the legacy. But it's also about maintaining the inheritance and the wealth of the family within the family. You didn't want your money, your inheritance, your property, your possession to be given to another family. So also marriage was crucial in the ancient world. And so men who were bachelors or celibate would have been frowned upon. You don't, that's not the appropriate thing to do. It wasn't valued. The way we may think about it today it's neutral. You get married, you marry, you not. But in the ancient world, it was a lot different. And so, just to give some overall structure, when we're looking at chapters 5, 6, and 7, Paul opens up chapter 5 with this discussion about immorality. He uses this metaphor of the leaven that is, it's in the community, and he talks about, cleansing the community. He uses that metaphor. Language of expulsion also emerges. In chapter 6, he talks about lawsuits. It's like this brief little detour. He talks about lawsuits, and then he goes back to about listing the behaviors, what is appropriate and what's incompatible with inheriting God's kingdom. And he discusses the temple as well. The temple's a big metaphor because yes, um, although we know that even like in First John talks about there are some sins that do not lead to death. Um, but there were some sins that were viewed more seriously, and Paul highlights sexual sins as one of these as well. That is very very important. So Paul does distinguish it. And then in chapter 7 is when we get to marriage and singleness. marital relationships between husband and wives, and he gives his advice and counsel on this, on also marriage, divorce, and mixed faith marriages. So this is another thing that Paul does. I do want to point out too that when we're reading Paul's text, it's not like women in the ancient world like the way it is today. They can go in if a file for divorce. A lot of women didn't have the same amount of rights that women have today. In the ancient world, it's very different. You know, and so the freedoms and opportunities of women was limited even more if they were slave women or servants of a household. Because even if there were marriages within households, the child that the family would have did not belong to them. It belonged to the owner of the house, to the main person. So we have to even think about what happens if they're servants and they get married and they have children. Um, in the ancient world, it was very, very, very different. And so Paul tries to give some counsel regarding this, especially advantages for singleness, devotion to the Lord, but also affirming that marriage is important. So here's the passage, the really important passage. This one also in chapter 6, but this is First Corinthians chapter 1, excuse me, First Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. And Paul says, "It is actually reported that there is immorality among you, and that immorality of such kind does not exist even among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. You have become arrogant and do not and have not mourned instead, so that the one who has done this deed would be removed from your midst. For I, on my part, though absent in body, but present in spirit, have already judged him who has so committed this, as though I were present. In the name of our Lord Jesus, when you are assembled, and I with you in spirit, with the power of the Lord of our Lord Jesus, I have decided to deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus." So here's the passage. Paul talks about, hey, I'm hearing that there's sexual immorality or fornication within the community. Now he doesn't call out this stepson by name, but everyone seems to know. Everyone knows who this person is. Now, again, we may think of this phrase that Paul uses here. He says he hears about sexual immorality. Now, it is a broad phrase to describe all sorts of different types of behaviors. And so it's important to see how is Paul using it, and how does it actually emerge within the literature of that time. Now, the word sexual immorality actually comes from the Greek word porneia. It doesn't mean pornography in the same way that we understand the term today. It refers primarily to marriage unfaithfulness, or engaging in illicit sex, or adultery, or even prostitution. So sexual immorality has this tone of adultery or unfaithfulness within a marriage covenant. And this term actually is used in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, and also in the New Testament as well. So it's the same term that is used to describe like adultery or prostitution. So when we look in the Old Testament, it makes mention of Tamar. If you can remember in the book of Genesis, how there's this language of Tamar who had a child, and this is from Genesis 38:24, about Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah. She had a child. Now the word there is often translated as harlot, but it's the same word that Paul uses. It's that same word like sexual immorality. And likewise, when we look in the book of Hosea, his wife is also called a prostitute. And that's the same word as well. It's the same term that Paul is using. He's talking about adultery or prostitution or engage in activity outside of sexual activity outside of marriage. This is the same term that also appears when Jesus is talking about adultery in Matthew. We find it in Matthew 5:32 when Jesus says, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of pornea, of like unchastity or, marriage unfaithfulness, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So you see this term used a lot also within the New Testament. And believe it or not, Jesus also had to deal with the reputation or the rumors of his own biological father. We have in John chapter 8, verse 41, where they accuse Jesus of being born of pornea, of fornication. In other words, they believed in the Gospel of John, Jesus's opponents were questioning the marital faithfulness of his mother. And they're like, look, we will know who our mother and our father is, but you, Jesus, you were have a questionable background in terms of who your real dad is. Which, like, can you believe that? Like somebody would actually tell that to Jesus. The language is there in chapter 8, verse 41. I could see, like Maury Pulver saying, you are not, or something related to that. They are just like, this is a serious charge that would have like, it would have like, whoa, they're talking about Jesus's mom. If I was the Apostle Peter, like, what? You cannot talk about a person's mom. Come on. But that's what we see in John chapter 8. They're questioning Jesus's family, his lineage, who his real father is. It's the same term that Paul uses in First Corinthians. And so when Paul uses this term, he's discussing it within the context of marital infidelity, which is very similar to what we see in John, what we see in Matthew, what we see in Genesis, and also Hosea. And so this language of immorality, this marital unfaithfulness, such of a kind that does not exist even among his Gentiles as someone has his father's wife. Now, Paul admits that this type of marital infidelity was unheard of. And he's actually surprised that the Corinthians are boasting about this relationship, except and not expelling this person. However, when we look at this, it makes us wonder, like, why would they believe that this is something to boast of? And again, as I mentioned, marriages in the ancient world, the age difference between a young woman who is getting married or offered into marriage and the groom and the man, the age gap would have been between 15 and 30 years old. So, women were given into marriage as very early at an early age. And a lot of men were getting married at a much, much older age. And so if you could think about like this type of context when the age gap between a husband and a wife was so wide, if the father had a son with another wife and the age difference would not have been that apart between the son and the stepmother. They could have been of a similar age. So regardless though, um, Paul did not believe that this was an appropriate thing to do. And so is this community, and it leads us to the question, is this community abusing the grace of God? Do they not realize that, hey, this is not appropriate? It's and it's also not legal, to be honest with you. When you're looking at the ancient world, what you're having is incest, although they may not be biologically related, and it could be a stepson with his father's wife. So although they're not biologically related, within Roman law, that would have been classified as incest. Because Roman law actually recognized that the law, the legal binding power of law, can make an adopted son as if he were a natural biological son, and likewise a stepson or anything like that. Roman law recognized that. And that's what the importance of law, where everything would have been viewed as if it were biological. So, yes, this would have been like some type of incest within this Corinthian community. But, they don't really seem to realize what they're doing. And so Paul tells them to expel them and leads us to the question, like, is Paul being too harsh here? Or did Paul misunderstand the grace that they were having toward one another? Or maybe this community was being a little bit too gracious. Paul does use this phrase that this type of activity does not exist among the Gentiles. So here's where I want to point out, like, step back a bit and let's look at how the Gentiles would have viewed this. Um, Now, again, I want to point out that this adultery that was happening in the Corinthian community, it was being celebrated. However, according to Roman law, it would have been illegal for them to engage in this type of activity. Now, I had mentioned earlier that the Romans were very conservative. Now, it is possible that Paul is just unfamiliar with Roman law. We don't really see Paul citing Roman writers. Paul doesn't cite Cicero or Virgil. He doesn't really cite a lot of the well-known and popular Roman writers. So we're really too unfamiliar with Paul and Paul's broader understanding of Roman literature. But once you go outside towards the West, the Romans themselves were very, very conservative. In fact, the notion of patriarchy, like it is patriarchy to the max in the Roman culture. There's like what the Romans do and how they develop the notion of patriarchy is way above and beyond what the Greeks did, and above and beyond, what you see in the ancient Near East. And so when you're thinking about the Romans, it's important to remember that they were conservative. They were a very conservative community. In fact, Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, he passed a number of laws. One of them was called the Lex Julia, around 18 years, 18 BCE, and the Lex Papia et Popea, which was a few decades later, around 9 CE. So this is during the time of Jesus' early childhood. And these laws that the Roman emperor passed was the first time that they were criminalizing adultery. So literally, the Roman emperor was making it illegal to have an affair. And if you read some of the Roman writers, it makes mention that overnight, half of all the men became criminals. So that's why these laws were also very unpopular. So a lot of the Romans were like angry that these laws were passed because then they criminalized them. And then, here we have these are the Augustan reforms. Caesar Augustus was trying to reform the Roman Empire by passing these laws, and he decreed them. So it was just basically him. So these laws were all a part of the emperor's aim to morally renew the Roman Empire. What you see here is that there was this assumption that in conquering so many regions and so many nations, that Rome became so wealthy, and Rome itself also accumulated so much wealth and accumulated so many people that they believed that they were now being corrupted and conquered from within. And so there's these phrases that in conquering, we have been conquered. So there's always a suspicion that the wealth of the East and the luxury of the East was corrupting the moral values of the Romans. And that the Roman society was decaying and was going crumbling because of luxury and wealth and the morality of all of these foreigners. And so here you have this way of like pushing back against basically the expansion of the Roman Empire, the results of imperial expansion. Here we see the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus trying to implement this moral reform. And so he makes it illegal for Roman men to have an affair. He forces them to get married, so you can't be a bachelor anymore. And then he also is starting to promote childbearing, which is trying to encourage Roman men and women to have legal kids, legitimate kids, and no more kids through a servant or a slave or a foreigner, a Greek woman or something like that. It's now let us build up the Roman population. And so you see a lot of these phrases within Roman literature that they are failing to undo, they're failing to keep up and the values of Rome, and that they are promoting the extinction of the Roman people to the point that Rome, who has conquered the entire world, now by the simple fact of Roman men not doing their moral duty, are going to die off, and this great empire is going to be handed over to foreigners. So yes, there's a lot of eugenics theory in this moral reform. There's a lot of fear of the immigrant. There's a lot of fear of foreigners, suspicion towards the Greeks, and there's a way of trying to implement this population growth, bypassing certain laws. So, we see this here within the Roman these Roman laws implemented by Caesar Augustus. Now, Augustus, he included a bunch of these penalties. And so some of these penalties that he included were penalties on adultery. And this really made this whole notion all the more important because specifically a husband, if he found out that his wife was committing adultery, he needed to divorce her immediately. If he did not divorce her and stayed with her, the husband will be charged for pimping his wife, because then that would be the accusation. Well, he's allowing his wife to have affairs or have commit adultery, and he is profiting off of her activity. And so both the man and the woman will be charged. And we also see punishments that were now legally prescribed. So you start to see the father and the husband were given the right to kill the woman who is caught in adultery, including the male accomplice. But there were certain conditions, like you had to catch them in the act and you had to be kind of, or at least in proximity. It couldn't be a week later or 2 weeks later. It had to be during the act. And the justification was that the husband was in a fit of rage. And so that's how it was justified. We do see strikingly, which is what I find interesting, when you're looking at Paul, because this is where I am under the suspicion that maybe Paul was unaware of these Roman laws, which would have been more known in Italy and in Spain and North Africa. So because that's where you see the development of the Roman Empire, before it goes to Asia and Judea. But we do see a similar law in Jewish literature in the Old Testament specifically. And here's in Leviticus 20. It says in Leviticus 20, verse 10, if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and adulteress are to be put to death. So we see even in the Old Testament, death as a consequence for adultery. So this is what we see in the Old Testament, Leviticus. This is very similar to what we see in Roman law. Um, so when Paul uses this phrase that this is found not even among Gentiles, um, I think when you're looking at Paul kind of views the situation primarily through the East, or at least the morality of Greece, and may not be too much aware of what is going on in the West, in Spain, Italy, North Africa. So here's a challenge when he says this. One of the things we can notice that he doesn't draw on Roman or Jewish law to deal with this stepson, his wife and husband. Instead, he just says that hey, these people should be removed from your midst. Now, this is a punishment of exile. Um, but it also must be understood within the context of the death penalty. Because you find in Roman literature and in the Old Testament that death is actually the penalty for adultery. And if you can remember that famous story in the Gospel of John when they bring the woman who committed adultery before Jesus, and then you see the religious leaders debating with Jesus about, and then Jesus replies and tells them, he without sin throw the first stone, and then they all eventually leave. So this is a question about the interpretation of the Old Testament in the story of Jesus in the Gospel of John, about the woman who's committed adultery. Now look at Paul. Paul could have cited that passage, but he doesn't. Instead, he says that it is, to exile this person, to expel them from your community. So although, yes, we may see like kicking someone out of the church as very harsh, but this in itself was an act of grace. In itself, it is saving the community, but also saving that person because legally, according to Roman law and even according to the Old Testament, death is a consequence for adultery. But Paul doesn't go straight to the law. He doesn't cite Leviticus, and I don't think he's aware of Roman law. But instead, he encourages them to expel the community member. And when I read this text, and it may read harsh in our modern ears, but when we look at it in the ancient world, where legally death was the justification, or the natural result of their action, the consequence of their action. Paul's language or Paul's recommendation here is a little bit more it could be read as an act of grace. And here Paul kind of explains, he compares this moral couple to leaven that impacts the entire loaf of bread. And so he says in 1 Corinthians 5:8, therefore let us celebrate the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Because the sense of failure to remove the couple will infect the entire community. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like this, but this is difficult to do. And people do get hurt. But what we do see though is that the failure to protect the community and to allow something go unchallenged or unaddressed is sometimes even worse because it impacts it to everyone else. And we may think it's like, oh man, I'm kicking someone out of church or let them know that it's no longer appropriate for them to come. Um, you know, Within the context of Paul's recommendation, looking at these texts and abiding by these texts, or trying to discern how to apply these texts, it's important to realize that in the ancient world, in Roman law, in Jewish law, the real, thing that they should have done is justify their death. So exile, in many ways, is a form of grace. It's recognizing, like, hey, in this community, we're not going to tolerate these behaviors or activities, but we're not gonna like, you know, bring the wrath of God on you. But exile provides an opportunity for them to work things out apart from the community. So this language of exile is very important when we look at here in this Corinthian community. Afterwards, Paul reminds them, to not associate with immoral people, which would have included this so-called brother. But they misunderstood this. In other words, they misunderstood this to suggest that they are not to associate with the moral people of the world. And Paul says, like, hey, this is impossible. It's what you can do. You can escape the world. But really, the failure of the Corinthian church was that they were not holding themselves accountable for their sexual sins. They were boasting of this immoral relationship, and they were failing to uphold the ethical standards for the community. They also failed to realize that while God will deal with those outside of the church, their responsibility was to deal with those within it. So this is one of the first times you see Paul in in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. It's trying to encourage them to deal with these issues because they will grow and fester and impact the wider body of the community. So I've been discussing a lot on this, and I kind of want to open it up a little bit for a breakout room for us to discuss in terms of what Paul's doing here. So here we find Paul dealing with specific sexual sins that's impacting the entire church and their relationship. So thinking about this expulsion and grace context. First question: how do you balance the need for accountability within the church after a leader's sexual failure with the call to show grace and forgiveness? So these are two things: accountability, grace, and forgiveness. How do we navigate these? Or second one, what role do you think church leadership should play in addressing issues of sexual sins within the congregation? Is human sexuality simply a personal matter? And then number three, how do you understand the distinction between the church's responsibility to address sin within its community and God's role in judging those outside the church? And this is a question, it's an ethical question. Should we let the world be the world